All right, welcome and thank you for joining this very last thematic session of this year's PIAAC conference. My name is Carla Hornberg. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the WZB, and I will share some first insights from a joint research project conducted together with my colleagues Heike Solger and Jan-Paul Heisig. Importantly, we just recently agreed that the title and storyline as presented today will be adapted eventually. So we really look forward to your feedback and will gladly take it into account when restructuring our ideas. With that in mind, let's dive into our preliminary findings on the impact of COVID-19 on the education-training relationship, drawing, of course, on the PIAAC data. The education-training relationship, just briefly, refers to the well-established finding that participation in adult training increases with level of formal qualification. A complementarity also referred to as the Matthew effect. Such training inequalities have gained renewed attention in light of the labor market disruptions caused by the pandemic. Specifically, across countries, calls for more inclusive adult training opportunities resurfaced as they are seen as key to matching changing skill needs, preventing downward occupational mobility, or even unemployment, and securing skilled labor and productivity. As for many dimensions of inequality, at the start of the pandemic, different scenarios were discussed with more optimistic perspectives envisioning an equalizing impact of COVID-19 on adult training access, for example, driven by increasing adoption of online learning and more flexible work schedules. By contrast, pessimistic perspectives expected training inequalities to intensify under greater economic uncertainty. 5 years on, some developments have been established empirically, including that participation rates in adult education and training stagnated or declined in most countries, which is in line with findings that employers who remain the main sponsors of adult training also during COVID-19 reduced their training investments considerably. On-the-job training was disrupted, but online learning increased, particularly among disadvantaged groups, including those with lower levels of education. Moreover, training inequalities did narrow in most countries, but largely due to participation declines among typically advantaged groups, which certainly does not capture optimistic perspectives adequately. It is important to note, however, that most studies focus on the entire working age population rather than on employed adults. So the observed trends may at least partly reflect that many workers moved into unemployment or inactivity during COVID-19, which is a key barrier to training access. Importantly, such compositional shifts in the employed population, let alone their implications for training inequalities, are not well understood to date. Moreover, we know relatively little about whether and how training determinants have shifted. Against this backdrop, we examine the impact of COVID-19 on the education-training relationship among employed adults, focusing on job-related non-formal training as the most common form of adult education and training, and we address two main research questions. That is, first, have, and if so, how have inequalities in job-related non-formal training participation by educational attainment changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how have the factors contributing to training inequalities shifted? To address these questions, we depart from our stylized theoretical model on of the education-training relationship as we've developed it in previous work already. Following this model, training inequalities between education groups are expected to be shaped by two main intermediary factors. That is, first, labor market allocation, and second, individual work characteristics. The role of labor market allocation captures that education groups differ with regard to their job tasks, other job characteristics, and firm environments, which in turn should contribute to unequal access to training. The role of worker characteristics accounts for compositional differences regarding individual learning disposition or skills, and socio-demographic and socioeconomic characteristics such as migration background or health which should also add to unequal training participation. While worker characteristics and labor market allocation are certainly related to each other, for example, in that higher skilled workers are allocated to more cognitively demanding jobs, we expect both factors to uniquely contribute to the education-training relationship. And for the pre-COVID period, we have indeed established not only that both factors contribute to the education-training relationship above and beyond each other, but that labor market allocation is even more important than individual worker characteristics across countries, despite salient institutional differences, highlighting the strong embeddedness of training opportunities into workplaces. Following this model, there are 4 major pathways through which COVID might have affected the education-training relationship and the relative importance of its contributing factors. Path A and C on the left-hand side here refer to shifts in compositional differences, while path B and D on the right-hand side relate to changes in training determinants. Beginning with path A and C, there are several mechanisms through which COVID-19 might have affected compositional differences, including unequal risks of employment and inactivity, reallocation dynamics, or health risks, to name just a few. Broadly speaking, the idea is that compositional differences should have shifted if education groups were unequally affected by societal disruptions, but to date, the direction of such shifts is far from straightforward. On the one hand, COVID-19 could have reduced compositional differences between education groups and consequently also training inequalities. For instance, if the group of less educated workers became positively selected because its most vulnerable members, such as those in precarious employment or with low skills, were disproportionately pushed into unemployment or inactivity. On the other hand, compositional differences may have increased, for example, if workers with intermediate levels of education were pushed into lower skilled jobs or industries, while the higher educated counterparts largely retained their positions at the top of the occupational hierarchy. Regarding the relative importance of labor market allocation versus worker characteristics, we'd expect worker characteristics to have become more important if compositional differences between education groups became more stratified along individual rather than job and firm characteristics. Turning to path B and D, optimistic scenarios suggested that online training, remote work, and short-time work should increase flexibility and reduce training inequalities. Moreover, an associated momentum of self-organized learning further entails that individual worker characteristics, including their motivation to learn, or also family obligations, should have become increasingly important. Pessimistic scenarios, in turn, emphasized greater uncertainty about returns to training, especially in smaller firms, low-skilled sectors, and manual sectors, where less educated workers are overrepresented, therefore reinforcing both training inequalities and the role of labor market allocation. For the empirical analysis to follow up on these expectations, we use individual level data from the second PIAAC cycle for 30 countries, 25 of which also participated in cycle 1, which allows for the pre-COVID comparison. We restrict our sample to prime age employees with at least 1 year of tenure to match our dependent variable, which is participation in job-related non-formal training within 12 months prior to the interview. Note that as the data were collected between September 2022 and May 2023, the period for reporting training participation started in October 2021, which is well before the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our key independent variables compare less or tertiary educated workers against intermediate educated workers. Accordingly, we distinguish between the lower and the upper training gap. To capture labor market allocation, we include measures of job tasks, other job characteristics, and firm characteristics. Worker characteristics are subdivided into learning disposition, measured by numeracy proficiency and the big 5 traits, and a set of socio-demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. I believe you are all well aware of issues complicating comparisons between the 2 PIAAC cycles, so I won't go into detail here. Just keep in mind that our results are preliminary and for now also rather conservative. Analytically, we rely on country-specific linear probability models of job-related non-formal training on the low or tertiary education indicator to estimate the unadjusted or raw training gaps, to assess the relative contributions of the 3 predictor sets. We include them too and apply Shapley decomposition, which accounts for path dependencies between the predictor sets when removing one of the sets from the equation. On that note, let's now turn to the results, beginning with our first research question of how training inequalities by educational attainment have changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here you see training participation rates by educational attainment both before COVID in panel A on the left-hand side and during COVID in panel B. And we see that during COVID, there were drops in participation rates in most countries and across education groups, which is important to keep in mind now when interpreting shifts in training inequalities. On that note, let's turn to shifts in the lower training gap, that is differences in training participation between less and intermediate educated workers as captured by the purple bars here. Comparing the length of these bars between panel A and B, we already observe a reduction in size of the lower training gap during the COVID-19 pandemic in many countries. So, indicating that the lower training gap decreased in these countries. And this intuition is confirmed this intuition is confirmed by the scatter plot depicted in panel C in the lower part of the slide, with most countries ranging in the upper part of the triangle, and only 3 countries ranging in the lower part of the triangle. I will get to them in a second. To better understand how these shifts come along, I have zoomed into 3 countries experiencing moderate reductions in the lower training gap, namely Lithuania, Czechia, and Slovakia. And what we see is, when we look at the upper hand of the slide, that reductions are driven by drops in participation rates for intermediate educated workers rather than by increases for less educated workers. On the other hand, there are these 3 countries who experienced increases in the lower training gap, that is Canada, the UK, and the US, so prototypical Anglo-Saxon countries. And these increases are driven, as we can see also here by the comparison on the upper hand, by drops in training participation for less educated workers rather than by increases for intermediate educated workers, so again, not an integrative story. For the upper training gap, we see that changes in size are more diverse, with roughly half of the countries experiencing increases in the size of the upper training gap and the other half reductions. But still, again, same story, we find that reductions are oftentimes driven by considerable drops in training participation among the better educated, the tertiary educated group here, rather than by increases for the less educated or the intermediate educated group in this instance. Whereas in turn, increases mainly reflect participation drops for intermediate educated workers. Now let's see how the relative importance of contributing factors evolved. Here you see the results of our Shapley decompositions using PIAAC cycle 1 data, just as a brief reminder to confirm that we actually found pre-COVID that labor market allocation has been the most important contributing factor both to the lower and the upper gap across countries, which is depicted here by the comparison between the black bars and the small gray bars. So the black bars capture the contribution of labor market allocation, the gray bars of worker characteristics based on Shapley decomposition. Beginning now with insights from analysis drawing on the latest PIAAC release during COVID, we find that in most countries and for both training gaps, labor market allocation remains the most important contributing factor, which is captured by the green bars. However, especially for the lower gap, there are some countries, including Sweden, Finland, and the US, where socio-demographics seem to play an important role, as reflected by relatively large blue bars in these instances. So to wrap up, main takeaways for now is that training inequalities by educational attainment actually declined in many countries. Especially at the lower end of the educational distributions. Shifts are mainly linked to drops in participation rates among employed adults. And what we also see is that labor market allocation is still the most important predictor of training inequalities by educational attainment in most countries. What I would like to get into for the discussion, or would be particularly interested for feedback, is that we for future work, we intend to account that, of course, during the last decade of the first and the second PIAAC cycle, there were other large-scale societal disruptions happening besides the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We had an economic upswing after the financial crisis, but we had increase in migration flows, we had technological advances, especially considering just how far AI have gotten in the last couple of years. So we are not so sure right now whether we, or probably we actually plan on really kind of dropping the COVID story so much and rather making it about a larger scale societal changes story over the last decades. Follow up on this, so I would be interested in your feedback on this point. We will, to disentangle this a bit more better, draw on more fine-grained differentiation of the predictor set. So look at health, for example. I mean, health should be rather COVID-related, but then we could look how much compositional shifts in migration background were a contributing factor, accounting for these trends, job tasks, computer use, you know, dive into detail a bit more. And also add descriptive statistics on compositional shifts in the employed population. So how is this even involved? And yeah, so these are just some facts to consider, and I'm looking forward to your feedback in this regard. Thank you very much.
Clarification questions? So these are today's three excellent presentations. So I'd like to just open up the floor for discussion, Q&A. Anybody has any questions, comments?
Thank you very much for the. My question is actually, my comment is related to the last presentation. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I think I do agree with your last point that maybe it's a little bit risky to put the focus on COVID because of so many things happening. I also believe that COVID played an important role. I would look into the possibility of. I'm not familiar with the Shapley method or anything like that, but like, I wonder if we could try to, if you could try, if you would be interested in to try to predict these shifts based on policy differences between countries. For example, in the Nordic context, it is pretty common to use examples such as Norway and Sweden, which are economically, culturally, historically pretty close, but they have two very different approaches. And then take kind of like an instrumental variable-ish approach to take these kind of doomy kind of things and predict them to explain part of it. I think it is definitely material for the discussion, introduction, and all of that. But yeah, the framing, I think it should be in general broader, and it is very interesting regardless.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. I also completely believe that there is a large COVID effect, because really these training, you know, the span when the various were collected, there was still COVID affecting labor markets and of course training. So the drops we see, I think that these are actually COVID related. But of course, you know, making the whole comparison and shifts in factors just about COVID, this is something that we also thought should be broadened up, and which would even make it more interesting, you know, that makes it even more exciting also in diving into some factors. And country differences, we will absolutely dive into this. This is, I think actually that this project will eventually, you know, be split into several publications just because there's so much to get out of it and so many open questions still. But thank you, yeah, that's a really important input to follow up on. Thank you.
Before I forget it, because that was a question for us. Actually, thank you so much. I also felt it is really interesting to see that if gaps are closing, then they are closing because the better educated participate less, which is not the direction we wanted. To communicate that to policymakers that there's something going on. You also mentioned that the data collection took place in a time where little or no adult education was provided as a regular shape. But perhaps you also know the adult education survey that came up, I think, in the end of 2020. The 2020 data collection showed that the low qualified adults increased their participation in adult education and training because they underwent so much retraining on how to handle the COVID at work. So that was a large share. So I feel there was, within 2012 and 23, there's not a decline whatsoever, but there's probably something like that. And this is something you can tackle by checking the adult education surveys that have like 3 to 5 years differences.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's correct, and also as I meant, especially for online learning. In fact, during COVID at the beginning, 2020, 2021, it was the classical vulnerable groups that experienced increases. So it's not too far-fetched to expect a reduction in training inequalities to actually be a good story. But so it's something to follow up on. Why?
And health meant Gefahrenbelehrung.
Yeah.
You know, working under the COVID.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Just to follow up. So the data collection was 22, 23, and we frame it as post-COVID because it's not really COVID anymore. Yeah. COVID had other types of effects like more home office, etc. But I think one of the main issues is compared to the decade before is that we have a lot more informal training. And we're only measuring non-formal training. We're measuring it differently than in cycle 1. But I think just really the informal learning sector has increased, and we're not capturing that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are some variables on informal learning, right? I haven't, not in the training sector, but rather in the STARS sector. Then you could at least have some trend analysis maybe with these. But of course, also the shift in the variable framing. I think it really makes sense maybe for this training story to really combine a few data sources and at least for robustness checks, double check in the background to keep these issues in mind. Yeah. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, that's great.
Quick follow-up question. So this is more like a general question. How long does it usually take for the you see the changes in the statistics in like job-related, non-formal education participation once any sort of social changes occurs, or is there like time lag between something happens and then participation statistics react in few years, or that happens right away, or based on your observation in the previous data, like what's the sort of like a time lag between the social changes and changes in education participation?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, I wouldn't be able to answer this with the PIAAC data, as it's, you know, cross-sectional and retrospective, and there are only the 2 time spans. That's actually something I would have to dive into further. I just know for sure that with COVID, because there were a few employer surveys directly, you know, in 2020, 2021, which actually asked the employers how they reacted to COVID, and they, of course, they had to react very promptly with this job-related non-formal training, as it often happened on the job, but people were no longer on the job, so they had to come up with new solutions. So in this particular instance, there was, at least for these types of training, a very instant adoption. But yeah, thinking now also about, okay, other societal phenomenons, that's a nice thought to think about. Thank you.